Indiana Fever fans have reached a breaking point. What began as cautious optimism following a coaching change has deteriorated over the course of just a few weeks into one of the more publicly fractured situations in recent WNBA history. The frustration is no longer confined to post-game analysis or social media arguments. It is structural, and it is growing. To understand how the franchise arrived at this point, it helps to revisit the final months of the Christie Sides era. Not as a cautionary tale, but as context for everything that followed, Sides inherited a roster in disarray. The Indiana Fever had spent several consecutive seasons posting records that reflected organizational drift as much as on-court failure. When Sides was brought in, the expectation was stabilization. What she delivered, over time, was something closer to a genuine competitive foundation. The team made the playoffs, the roster showed signs of cohesion, and at the center of it all was a player whose arrival had fundamentally altered the league's commercial and competitive landscape. What is now becoming clearer, in retrospect, is that Sides appeared to read the room in a way that the front office did not. According to people familiar with the situation, she understood that her position was likely transitional regardless of results. The incoming regime had its own vision, its own preferred staff, and its own plans for the roster. Under those circumstances, Sides made a pragmatic calculation. She would give her star player as much latitude as possible, step back from the kind of tactical constraints that might have bred resentment, and allow the situation to develop on its own terms. Whether that was strategy or resignation is debatable. What is not debatable is that it worked, at least in the short term. The player thrived. Fans, many of whom are now openly nostalgic about that period, remember it as a time when the basketball felt alive. That energy has largely evaporated. Stephanie White arrived with genuine credentials and a narrative that seemed to write itself. A former standout player, a coach with college and professional experience, and perhaps most importantly, an established relationship with the franchise's central figure. These were all reasons for optimism. The reunion angle was real. So was the goodwill. It has not translated. In one recent game, White deployed 21 different lineup combinations. That number warrants examination not as a statistical curiosity but as a diagnostic. Coaching staffs adjust lineups in response to matchup problems, foul trouble, defensive breakdowns, and momentum shifts. That is normal. 21 combinations, however, suggests something beyond tactical adjustment. It suggests an absence of a settled identity, a coaching staff that has not yet determined, or cannot agree upon, what this team is supposed to look like. Fans noticed. Viewers, including many who had invested significant emotional energy into this team's resurgence, began disengaging. Comments across platforms described the experience of watching this team as genuinely frustrating, not because the results were poor, but because the process appeared incoherent. When a franchise spends years rebuilding its reputation as a destination for the league's top talent, and then puts that talent in situations that appear to undermine rather than elevate it, the audience responds accordingly. The specific criticism that has resonated most forcefully is the management of crunch time minutes. Benching the team's most effective offensive player during late-game possessions, the moments where games are decided, is the kind of decision that demands a compelling explanation. No such explanation has been offered publicly. In the absence of one, the perception that took hold among fans and commentators alike is that the coaching staff is either uncertain how to deploy its most valuable asset or is actively resistant to, depending on her in high-leverage situations. Neither interpretation reflects well on the staff. It is worth pausing here to note what this player represents, not just to Indiana, but to the league as a whole. Her arrival triggered a measurable shift in attendance figures, television ratings, and sponsorship interest across the WNBA. Road game attendance at venues that had spent years operating well below capacity began to climb. Television windows were renegotiated. Charter flights, a quality-of-life standard that players had been advocating for years without success, became a near-immediate reality. These outcomes were not the product of a league-wide marketing campaign or a collective bargaining breakthrough. They were the downstream effects of a single player's ability to draw an audience. Managing that kind of asset requires a different calculus than managing a rotation player or even a standard franchise cornerstone. The margin for error is smaller, the stakes are higher, and the relationship between organizational decision-making and player satisfaction is more consequential. What the Fever's front office appears to be discovering somewhat late is that this calculus extends far beyond game night lineups. Reports from sources described as being close to the front office suggest that contract extension discussions have stalled in a significant way. The player, whose current deal will eventually expire, has become what sources describe as non-committal about her long-term future in Indiana. That characterization, if accurate, represents a significant departure from the optimism that surrounded her initial arrival. Several factors are cited. The off-season roster decisions drew internal criticism, with sources suggesting that certain signings were viewed skeptically by the player and those in her circle. More telling, perhaps, is a detail that received relatively little attention at the time but has since been reassessed. Her partner departed his position in Indianapolis without pursuing other employment in the area. That kind of decision does not typically happen in isolation. It suggests, at minimum, that the possibility of a future elsewhere has been entertained seriously enough to factor into life planning. The front office's response to mounting media scrutiny has done little to diffuse the situation. Several prominent voices covering the team have found themselves blocked by team executives on social media platforms following critical coverage. Among those cited is Amber Cox, a senior figure within the organization. Whatever the intent, the effect has been to create the impression of an administration that is more focused on controlling the narrative than addressing the underlying problems. That impression is corrosive, particularly in a media environment where the absence of official comment is routinely filled by speculation and sourced reporting that the organization cannot rebut because it has severed the communication channels. The Nike situation adds another layer to this. Signature shoe deals represent a particular kind of institutional recognition, an acknowledgement that an athlete has achieved a commercial profile that justifies a dedicated product line with its own design identity and marketing infrastructure. For an athlete whose impact on the WNBA's financial trajectory is well documented, the absence of such a deal stands out. Other athletes with smaller audiences and more modest commercial footprints have had signature products developed and released with far greater urgency. The delay does not appear to be a logistical oversight. It reflects something about how the institution views its obligations to the athletes whose labor and visibility generate the revenues that sustain it. This is a recurring tension in professional sports, and it is not unique to women's basketball. Athletes at the peak of their cultural influence often find themselves in a position where the institutions surrounding them are eager to benefit from their profile while remaining reluctant to offer the kind of structural support. Contract flexibility, roster investment, creative latitude, institutional backing that might allow that influence to compound over time. The player at the center of this situation is not unaware of this dynamic, nor, based on available reporting, are the people around her. The on-court treatment has also become a point of serious contention. Physical play in professional basketball is expected and accepted. What players and their advocates have described in this case goes beyond normal competitive contact. Persistent holding, tactical fouling, and targeted physical pressure that officials have not consistently addressed have created a situation where the player absorbs a disproportionate share of contact without the protection of reliable officiating. When she responds to that contact with visible frustration, the reaction from segments of the media tends toward analysis of her temperament, rather than scrutiny of the conditions that produce the frustration. That asymmetry is notable. Elite male athletes operating under comparable physical pressure are routinely afforded a degree of latitude in their emotional expression that is treated as part of the competitive intensity that makes them compelling to watch. When the same competitive intensity surfaces in this context, the framing shifts. The player becomes the subject of the story in a way that centers her reaction rather than the circumstances that provoked it. Fans are aware of this. The comment sections, the fan forums, the social media threads. These spaces reflect an audience that has developed a fairly sophisticated understanding of the structural forces at work. What they are expressing, in increasingly direct terms, is impatience with an organization that does not appear to share that understanding, or if it does not appear willing to act on it. The nostalgia for the Christie Sides period is real, and it deserves to be taken seriously rather than dismissed as sentiment. What fans are describing when they express that nostalgia is not simply a preference for one coach's personality over another's. They are describing an environment in which the player appeared to be operating with a sense of freedom and engagement that made her, and by extension, the team, compelling to watch. That environment produced results. It also produced the kind of goodwill that is difficult to manufacture and easy to squander. The current staff has not created that environment. Whether it is capable of doing so is a question that the front office will need to answer, and answer relatively soon, given the timeline implied by the contract situation. A player of this profile does not remain in a holding pattern indefinitely. The leverage, financial and otherwise, that she has accumulated off the court, endorsement income, media presence, cultural capital, means that a decision to leave Indiana in 2028 would not represent the kind of career sacrifice it might for another player in a different set of circumstances. She does not need this franchise in the way the franchise needs her. That is an unusual dynamic, and it is one that the organization has, by most accounts, been slow to fully internalize. The broader stakes are significant. The television deals that the WNBA has secured in recent years, the expansion franchises that have entered the league with substantial financial backing, the renewed interest from corporate sponsors who had maintained a largely indifferent posture toward the league for decades. All of these developments occurred in an environment shaped in meaningful part by this player's presence and visibility. A departure would not make those gains disappear overnight, but it would create a context in which the league would need to demonstrate that the conditions that generated that growth were structural, rather than contingent on a single player's decision to remain. That is a demonstration the league is not currently in a position to make with confidence. The Indiana Fever have an opportunity to course correct. The talent is there, the audience interest is there. The infrastructure, imperfect as it currently appears, is in place. What is missing is a coherent vision for how to manage the most consequential player in the league's recent history in a way that serves both her development and the team's competitive aspirations. That vision has not been communicated clearly to the coaching staff, or if it has, the coaching staff has not yet found a way to execute it. 21 lineup combinations in a single game is a symptom. The underlying condition is an organization that has not resolved internally what it wants to be or how it intends to get there. Until that resolution occurs, the games will remain difficult to watch, the rumors will continue to circulate, and the player at the center of it all will continue to weigh her options. The fans who are currently disengaged, who are describing themselves in comment sections as checked out, are not abandoning their interest in the player. They are abandoning their willingness to watch an institution fail to make use of something remarkable. That distinction matters. Their frustration is not apathy. It is a specific kind of disappointment reserved for situations where the gap between what is possible and what is being realized is obvious and unnecessary. Whether the Fever's front office is capable of closing that gap before the situation becomes irreversible is the central question hanging over this franchise heading into the remainder of the season.